Speaker Ryan said that NATO is indispensable, and I'm wondering, do you think that President Trump would agree, and do you think that he has some valid, just constructive criticisms for the group?
Well, certainly I think the president is making the case that has been made by Americans, by the United States for a long time, about the importance of those European nations, members of NATO, meeting their contribution to the effort, the 2% of GDP. And then, I mean, that case needs to be made. The president's making it. But I do know in this world, for an economic reason, for our national security reasons, we need NATO to be allies. We need this to be in good stead with each other. We need uniformity as a sense of community, particularly as the president enters into discussions with Russia and President Putin at the beginning of next week. So, yes, let's make the case for those European nations doing better, meeting their commitments. But let's do it in a way that keeps NATO allies together as we try to make the world a better place, both economically and from a national security point of view.
I'm glad you bring up Russia because you spent your 4th of July in Moscow along with 7 other Republican lawmakers, the first congressional delegation to the country since 2014. You gave a stern message to the Russians on not to meddle in U.S. elections. Do you worry that that is inconsistent with what the president will say to Vladimir Putin?
Well, I don't know what the president will say when he visits with President Putin. What I do know is that the administration officials that I've heard or talked to in advance and during my trip to Russia, they were on point with what we've just been saying and what we said to Russians. And that is, you need to change your behavior if you want the United States to change its relationship, particularly as it relates to sanctions. You need to have a different approach in Syria. You need to remove yourself from Crimea and the Ukraine. And most importantly, you need to stay out of the U.S. elections in 2018 and 2020. This needs to come to an end. And that was confirmed to me. I mean, I had conversations before I left for Russia with undersecretaries of state at the State Department. Certainly the ambassador to Russia was firm in his belief that those messages needed to be delivered.
Right.
And I heard John Bolton say the same thing when he was in Russia. So the administration has made the point. Again, having said that, I don't know what the conversation will be when the president's actually sat down and have a conversation.
That's a fair point, but up to this point, we've also seen the president seemingly embrace Vladimir Putin. How frustrated are you with the president's willingness to embrace Putin and his seeming reluctance to hold Vladimir Putin accountable for whether it's Russian meddling in U.S. elections or their actions in Ukraine?
Well, I think the United States needs to hold Russia accountable. I'm not at all complaining that the two leaders are talking. If I believe we shouldn't be visiting, I would not have made a visit to Russia to have a dialogue. But what's important is what is the message that's delivered, and what I hope the president says is the same thing that I and others said when we were in Russia. Your behavior has to change.
Yeah.
We want a relationship. We want a responsible relationship, and we should have one. The world needs us to have one because of issues that really do allow us to work together, particularly nuclear proliferation, relationship at the moment with North Korea, but also in a fight against terrorism. There are reasons that Russia and the United States can be working together, but if they want a strong relationship, if they certainly want the sanctions, which Congress, in the most recent instance, put in place itself, then they need to know here's the steps that are necessary. And my experience was they just denied everything. And I also would suggest that I know the presidents are meeting together by themselves.
Right.
Our experience was the Russians are propagandists. Their reports of our meetings were totally different than what actually occurred during those meetings. And I would want witnesses there backing up my point of view in that setting.
Senator, I want to shift gears a little bit since you are a member of the Commerce Committee and talk about trade. And I'm just wondering, do President Trump's trade policies help or hurt the people of Kansas?
We are a trade-dependent state. We earn a living in Kansas by what we sell around the world. That's in part because we're an agricultural state. It's because we manufacture automobiles, we manufacture a lot of airplanes, and our ability to get supplies that are not subject to tariffs and our ability to export through trade agreements to Mexico, Canada, and to the Pacific are vital to our state's future. So I've had conversations with the president. I've had conversations with the administration. Trade matters. And at the end of the day, you can negotiate these agreements, but at the end of the day, we need the relationship that we have that comes through trade. It helps us economically. And I just listened to the reports before I arrived on set. This is about the economy, but it's also about world stability. We're talking about Europe and NATO. Our economic alliances and trade help us make a more stable world. So for both reasons, this needs to be a good outcome.
Senator,
okay?
I'm sorry to break in here, but at what point then are you willing to say to the president, we're going to take an active stance to perhaps cut out your power with respect to trade, take the reins and change some of the approaches that he has currently taken?
Well, we just had a vote in the United States Senate just a few moments ago, 88-11, in which we instructed, Senate terminology, we instructed the conferees on the National Defense Authorization Bill, on the Appropriations Bill, to report back to us with language that returns to Congress the authority on Section 232 sanctions. So that statement has just been made today. Broadly supported. I think it was approved by every Democrat and all but maybe 11 Republicans. So at least a message was delivered. And again, I think you could make this case regardless of who is president. Congress needs to increase its authority, its jurisdiction, the things that the Constitution gives us. We need to continue to play a significant role. And 232 is being used in a way that was never intended by the grant of Congress to begin with.